Welcome to our next chat with an expert. I'm very excited for this talk with John Finger, who is the co-founder and CEO of Hog Island Oyster Company, an oyster brand that needs really no introduction. We're very grateful for you to take the time to chat with members.
I'm excited as well. I think what you guys have done and are doing is a good thing and really fun. So thanks for inviting me.
Absolutely. So I know you have a very long history in aquaculture. Would you be able to tell us in your own words your journey?
Oh boy, yeah. So this is our 40th year in business, which is I'm beginning to realize is a big deal. I really wasn't thinking that was that big of a deal until I tell more people, and they're like, "Yeah, a lot of businesses don't make it that far." But I like to joke around that I was 4 years old when I started the business, but I wasn't. Yeah, I don't know if people can tell or not, but I'm originally from the East Coast. I grew up on the East End, Long Island, New York, and grew up fishing and clamming and hunting. I worked on potato farms as a kid. My family wasn't into it, they were just around, and loved being in the salt water. Went to school for marine biology in Southampton over on the South Fork of Long Island. Was also into food. As my family, we grew our own vegetables growing up. I worked in restaurants through college and really decided that's where my path laid. I wanted to combine my love of marine biology and my love of food and restaurants and experiences. And the funny thing is oysters are the only seafood I didn't eat growing up. I didn't even study them in college. I didn't take an invertebrate zoology class. I was a fish guy. And I had done one semester internship in California, thought being a surfer, that would be a fun place to live for a couple of years, and came back out and started knocking on doors. And the first job was for an oyster company. Thought it was a good foot in the door. It was owned by a big corporation. I didn't like how they were running things, but they were down in the Monterey Bay area. They bought a farm up in Tamales Bay that I went up to and trained a crew. At that point in time, I was in management. I worked there 2.5 years and really just fell in love with the environmental connection that shellfish farming has to place. It really is about place. And at that point in time, I still was thinking I was going to move back east. But back then, it was a lot harder to permit new farms on the East Coast than it was on the West Coast. That's totally reversed. I had way more connections out here. Tamales Bay actually reminded me a lot of where I grew up. If it was flat, it would be like Long Island. When I grew up, you could hop on a train and be in Manhattan in 2 hours. Here, we could get on the road in an hour and a half. You're in San Francisco. So I decided to start Hog Island out here. And I think I got our first lease, started in 82, got permitted in 83. I think we planted our first oysters in the July of 1983. So that was the beginning.
You just said that you wanted to combine all of your passions and interests together to oyster farming. Was there a particular moment that you remember that you were like, oysters, this is it?
It was one of my first trips up to Tamales Bay and being out on the water and being able to go, look, I can make a living doing this, being in a place like this. And that was really like, that, yeah, this is what I want to do. Now, of course, connecting the dots to financial viability from that moment to today took a little bit longer and a few stumbles along the way. But I really realized, like, wow, I can grow food in the marine environment and make a living. And that was just like, yeah, this is what I want to do.
When you started, actually, oyster brands were pretty novel of that time when people were still very focused on just your key oyster appellations and like those signature names. So can you tell us about what the market was like back then, and then why you chose to lean into brand building?
Yeah, I think there were a couple of factors. We were at that point in time, Pacific oysters, West Coast oysters, really weren't considered suitable for eating raw in the half shell. And that had more to do with how those oysters were being grown. Up until probably the early 80s, maybe late 70s, when single seed production started happening on a hatchery level where you could produce single oysters from day one, all the larvae was set on culch, on shell, and grew into clusters, right? And Pacific oysters, because of their fast growth, by the time they would grow apart enough to be able to break them off as singles, they were this big, right? So naturally, people said, yeah, you can't eat those oysters raw in a half shell. They're for frying and stewing or barbecuing or whatever. But when you were doing single seed production, and we were one of the first people to really do that, you could grow a nice small half shell Pacific oyster. And the funny thing was, when we started the market out here in the Bay Area, and it was very interesting because I worked in the wholesale end of the business before I could start paying myself. And I worked for my good college friend, Bill Marinelli, who a lot of people probably know. And Billy and I were both native Long Islanders who would get totally frustrated because on every menu that served oysters on a half shell in the Bay Area, it said Blue Point, which hadn't seen an oyster that was safe to eat in 40 years. And they were coming from all over the place, and the name really didn't mean anything anymore. So that was one of the factors to the branding. And the other thing is we really did think we were doing something different. I had spent some time in Europe, in Ireland, and in Spain, had seen some of what high quality half shell production could look like. And we wanted to make sure that if we were going to be doing this extra work, that it was recognized in the marketplace. I tell people all the time, it was one of the, you make a lot of mistakes early on, but the smart thing we did in the beginning was to say, look, we want these sold under this name, under Hog Island. And as I said, I was working part-time in the wholesale business at that point in time, and talking to some of the old wholesalers down at Fisherman's Wharf, they went, that's a horrible name. People think about pigs and shit and dirt. And now it's a trademark name, one of the most widely named. But the lucky thing we did was that we got in. I tell a lot of people, I think it was about right time, right place. We were getting going in the early 80s. The California food movement was really going. We happened to get into two restaurants called Chez Panisse and Zuni Cafe, who were at the vanguard of that movement, and asked them to please put them on the menu as Hog Island. And then that was it. Next thing I know, I have a magazine coming and wanted to write about us, and it snowballed. I don't want to take all the credit. I think a lot of it was really right time, right place.
You should take a lot of the credit.
There's one of the few smart things we did over the years.
Where did the name Hog Island come from?
We do have a Hog Island in the Bay. And of course, the story was that a ship got wrecked there and some pigs got loose for a week or a day or a year, depending on the story. And all these years later, as we've had to protect our trademark, people don't realize, there's trademark erosion. If you don't protect your trademark, you lose the protection. As Blue Point Oyster Company lost trademark protection. But there are Hog Islands in many other bays in this country because settlers would use them as a place to put pigs. And ours happens to be a fairly small Hog Island. I've been to a few other Hog Islands on the East Coast. I've been to Hog Island Bay in Virginia now and stepped foot on that Hog Island. But ours is fairly small. I used to have a little house on it because a family ran a ferry taking the dairy goods from the Point Reyes Peninsula over to the railroad on our side of the bay.
What happened to it? It just, you couldn't.
Yeah, now it's part of the National Park Service. There's nobody living on it. We call it Guano Island. There's a lot of birds on it and a lot of seals.
That could be another trademark.
Yeah, there you go, Guano Island. I don't know.
When you were selling Hog Island oysters into San Francisco, did you hear a lot of no's at first before you heard that yes?
We did.
You did?
We did, and had to do some work with just like, here, taste these, try, this is what we're doing, look at this, that kind of thing. It was definitely a little bit of an uphill battle. And I've talked to some other people who've been at this for a while, like Bill Taylor and I have had this discussion about how dramatically the marketplace has changed in the last 30 to 40 years. So we had restaurants who weren't that interested, but then, like I said, we were lucky to get into a couple of restaurants that people paid attention to. And then next thing we knew, we had people asking us for oysters and people on quotas because we could never produce enough.
Yeah. Did you bring those chefs up to the farm?
Yes, absolutely. We've always felt from the get-go that education was part of what we needed to do and wanted to do and liked doing. So we've always done that and would have restaurant staff up. It's funny, all these years later, we'll do some trainings in restaurants, but they're not near as impactful as having restaurant staff out to the farm if you have that ability. It's huge.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And actually, it's a good segue into my next question. As long as I can remember, I've been wanting to go see the farm because you had a very unique at the farm experience for consumers. Do you feel like Hog Island has or continues to do something that is unique or uncommon in the oyster industry? And it doesn't necessarily even need to be public facing. It could be something behind the scenes. One
is we've always viewed part of what we do as having an educational component, whether it's at our restaurants or at our site. So we're very open. You've been to our site. We talk about it sometimes with our staff members. We can make it hard on our staff members because you have people around watching what you're doing a lot of times. And sometimes that's harder. You can't pick your nose or do whatever. You have to be a little careful, but we want people to ask questions. We want people to see what's involved in the process as much as we can. We can't always take people out on the water. Our sites are it's not like you go walk right out to a lot of where our growing areas are, but at least once they're hitting the shore, we want people to ask questions. We think that builds trust, that builds good consumers. So we always knew from an early stage that we wanted to do something direct to consumers too. We always knew that was part of what we wanted to do. It took us a little bit longer to get there. And the farm experience, especially, I think, was incredibly unique at its time when it was a very organic thing. I like to tell people, and we knew we wanted to do something like that, but it was putting our wet storage tanks in that really changed the game. And that's something we do that's different. We have filtered seawater tanks that all our harvests from Tamales Bay go into before we sell. And it's not something we have to do. As probably a lot of people on this call know, a lot of places in Europe, you have to do that. You have to put them in some sort of filtered seawater system if you want to sell them live. It's something we did because we have rainfall closures in Tamales Bay. If it rains too much in a 24-hour period, we get closed to harvesting. Winter used to be our biggest time of the year for marketplace. We wouldn't sell oysters in the summer because we never had enough. But that would cripple us if we got a lot of rainfall closures. So we put the seawater system in as a way to put our oysters in if we knew there was a storm coming. And then it was like, hey, we're along Highway 1. We can up the gates and sell live oysters to people. And then we had some customers go, gee, it'd be great if we could sit down and shuck these. So we put some picnic tables out. And then some customers go, gee, it'd be great if we could barbecue these. And so we put some Webers out. And the whole thing just blew up. It became way more than we ever envisioned. And it was a very organic sort of process to lead us to where we are today.
Oh, I love that. And that actually makes sense. If you do visit, you feel like the sections are added on to each other.
Yeah.
My next question, well, switching gears actually, because you grow now several species of oysters, not just the Pacific. Can you tell us about all the species that you produce?
I'll give you a little context historically to begin with, if that's okay. The West Coast of the United States, we have a native oyster. It's called the Olympia oyster. It's the same genus, different species as the European flat oyster. Very small, flat, takes 3 years to get to be a $half size or a little bit larger. The gold rush happened between a lot of Europeans wanting oysters and a lot of coastal development happening after that oyster got overfished. And in 1873, when they finished the Transcontinental Railroad, people decided to bring oysters out here. They decided instead of bringing full-grown oysters, they'd bring smaller oysters from the East Coast and dump them in the San Francisco Bay, Tamales Bay, and Willapa Bay up in Washington. And that was the West Coast industry for a lot of years. And then 1920s is when the Pacific oyster was introduced to the West Coast. So now everybody on the West Coast grows Pacific oysters. We all know it's the most widely cultured oyster in the world. So we grow mostly Pacific oysters. We've always grown Virginica or Eastern oysters. We really believe that's a great oyster for out here, especially for a summer oyster. So we continue to grow that oyster. I became enamored with a European flat oyster years and years ago when I worked for this other company, and have tried to continue to grow those over the year. They're not easy to grow. We've had ups and downs with those. We, of course, grow some of the Kumamotos. We'll start growing more of those when we're going to talk about our Humboldt operation. That's going to be a newer twist to things. And then we also grow a few of the Olympia oysters, the native oysters. We grow a little bit of them all. I think one of the few companies, maybe 2 or 3 on the West Coast, that grow all varieties.
Can you rank the species from easiest and least pain in the butt to the most?
So in some ways, the Pacific is the easiest because it's the fastest growing, the easiest to get reliable seed source. Of course, now we have our own hatchery. We don't have to worry about seed source as much. And I tell people this, that fast growth sometimes can be not an easy thing to deal with. We actually do a lot of things to slow them down. As people probably know, if a group of something is growing very quickly, you have more variation in size and shape. So that's the issue with Pacific. So if you're going to grow them, you want to actually slow them down so you can produce a nice half shell oyster that's not going to run right by you and become a small or a medium before you know what's going on. And then I'd say the Kumamotos, now that we had our Humboldt farm, is a fairly easy oyster to grow. It just takes a lot longer. Instead of a 1.5-year process, it's a 2.5-year process. And then probably right after that, the Virginica, for the same reason, they take a little bit longer to grow, as you might have a few more gear changes involved because of fouling, barnacle sets, all those kinds of things play a bigger factor now. And then definitely the European flat is the hardest one for us to grow. And the interesting thing about the European flat is they're very easy to grow for us anyhow, for the first year and a half. And then they all start dying. We have Bonamia, which is a protozoan parasite they have in Europe as well. And I think some areas on the East Coast have it as well. And when we've been successful before, we've been able to get them up to market size in about a year and a half. And that works pretty well. We've also been breeding for some disease resistance, but as anybody who's involved in farming knows, the worst thing that can happen to you is losing your animals after you've spent all the time and labor to get them near market size, which is what can happen with European flats.
Where does the Olympia fit in there?
Oh, the Olympia, yeah. Olympia would be wedged in between there because, again, they're very slow growing. It's at least a 3-year process. We're doing a little bit better because we're playing around with growing them subtidally. And then the major issue is, again, gear changes. Mollusk Bay is incredibly productive. If you grow anything subtidally, you're having to change your gear out at a minimum every 6 months because the fouling is intense, everything else growing on everything. So other than that, there's not a lot of sorting and grading involved with those.
And are those oysters just seasonal then?
Yeah, we target the Olympias and the European flats, or the French hogs, as we call them, for the holidays. We grow a very small amount of them, and then we try to target the holidays, which is a traditional French time for eating those oysters. The other oysters, of course, we sell year round. As I mentioned, we like Virginia out here on this coast for a summer oyster because we don't have real big temperature swings like we do on the East Coast. So we don't have any spawning changes that happen to that oyster in the summertime, which we might get some of that with Pacific oysters. So that's why I started growing it decades ago. And we still want that to be a good part of our program. So we'll sell that oyster year round when we have enough of it. We try to target our summer months more for that oyster.
Now, given that you have familiarity and love for European flats in Europe, what do you feel is the difference in that oyster grown in California?
I think ours are milder. If people are familiar with that oyster, it can have a pretty sharp, I don't know if that's the correct word, but I think of sharpness. I had one wholesaler who told me it was like sucking on a copper penny. Yeah. It could be very astringent, very metallic, high in iodine. Ours seem to be a little less mild than some of the ones I've had in France or even some of the ones I've had from the East Coast. And part of it could be because we're selling them a little younger as well. That might be why they're not quite as intense, but that's how I would chalk it up.
Okay, that's fair enough. We like California vibe.
Yeah, a little mellow.
You're teasing out that you now have a Humboldt farming location. Can you tell us more about?
Yeah, we had always wanted to spread out our production risk. We always wanted to have farms in multiple bays, especially after we started having our own restaurants. And Humboldt Bay was close enough to us that we felt we could manage it. The Harbor District was trying to pre-permit a bunch of sites up there to create more opportunity. We got involved in some of that planning process. It was at the same time that we started seeing the first effects of ocean acidification out here, and seed shortages were happening. So we're like going, how are we going to start another farm? We can't even get enough seed for our farm. And we thought about it and got talked into doing a hatchery. We were the first permitted hatchery in decades in California. It was not an easy thing to permit a hatchery. Hatcheries are not great revenue centers. We call them insurance policies that cost you a lot of money. But we decided that we were going to do all three up there, have a hatchery, a nursery, and a farm. The farm being really the linchpin because that's where the money is. Then the permitting process up there got stagnated. So this is going back to 2012. And we got tired of waiting around for the pre-permitting project to happen. So we permitted our own farm over the last couple of years. Got all our permits, I think mid-year last year. We have about 110 acres up there. And we're doing mainly SEPA baskets up there. So intertidal long lines. And we're starting to bring down our first oysters. And we're going to focus a lot on Kumamotos. I think Humboldt Bay is probably the best bay on the West Coast for growing Kumamotos. Hands down, I think they're the best quality. So we're going to do a lot of Kumamotos there. We're producing those in the hatchery. And then we're going to do what we call high waters as a name for our Pacific oyster.
High waters. And your Kumamotos are in the SEPA as well?
Yes, but no floats on them, not tumbling, just
Right.
gentle wind and wave action.
Yes. Okay. And will they still take the same amount of time to grow out in that?
It seems that they will. Right now, it's still pretty early on. And we do have some rack and bag area permitted. So we might do some of those in rack and bag. We'll see how that goes. I'm a big fan of, even with Pacific oysters, starting them in a tumbling system, but finishing them in a rack and bag system. I think that combination produces a really nice oyster, nice meat quality.
Are those typically in the same location, or do you actually move locations as well to change up salinity and flavor profile?
Yeah, up there, it's slightly different locations, not enough to see differences in salinities. In Tamales Bay, we have 3 disparate locations that will move from early stage to late stage, depending on what time of the year we're wanting to harvest.
So now jumping into the final set of my questions is just looking across your oyster career. What is the one thing that you are the most proud of?
Wow, I think making it to 40 years for one. I think creating experiences in general, but particularly the one at the farm. I think what we created there for its time, like you said, was really unique and what is it? I can't remember what the term is, about flattery. We've had other farms who've come and looked at that and done their own. It's a great model to really build your brand. So we know other oyster companies are doing this now. The funny thing is you go over to Europe, especially to France, and there's degustation. We didn't know that. We didn't know that somebody else, it wasn't our idea. It was ours, might be a little bit bigger and a little bit more involved, but creating that sort of farm experience and creating just great experiences in general. It's funny, I was just talking to somebody this morning. I think if I really had to be really super proud of something, it's not quite an oyster related thing. It's about people. I tell people all the time that the best compliment I get is this is the best place I've ever worked. I have second generation people working for me whose dad started off working on the farm and now they're working on the farm, and people who have decades experience, even on the restaurant side. We pride ourselves in having 10-year plus people on our restaurant side. And we just feel like if you create a great place to work, you can create a great business. So that really, in the end, is really what it's all about.
Absolutely, I completely agree. Just
Yeah.
even the more I learn about oyster varieties, you tend to start getting drawn to the people over the product in some ways, or you appreciate the product so much more because you know the people behind it.
I tell people, I think we're lucky in this business that we've been in business 40 years. And part of this, I have helped create the demand because I've opened our own restaurants, but we've never met demand in 40 years in business. Never. And maybe because of that, I have a lot of really good friends in this business. And that's what I cherish, is these relationships I have with other growers on the West Coast, on the East Coast, France, people I've met around the world in this business. There's something about this that's pretty amazing. So I really cherish that.
To all the young oyster growers out there who aspire to build the same empire like yours, what advice
Empire.
what advice would you give them?
Don't start off thinking about empires. Don't do that. So I worked for a company that had oyster empires in their eyes, and they went belly up because they didn't share information. I would say be open, really be open to sharing your ideas and your thoughts with others. I think in business, there tends to be this thing about being protective of these special things you do. And really it comes down to execution in the end. And that's not something you can see over here and then copy over there. It really comes down to you or that person. So to me, it's about building those relationships. I mean, I could talk about early on, we didn't try to do too many things. I think that's another advice I would give. I was lucky I had Billy Marinelli, and he 2 times a week, I would drop oysters off in San Francisco and he could help build the market. I wasn't trying to build the market at the same time I was trying to grow a better oyster and do all those things. So trying to keep your focus a bit narrow in the beginning, I think is important. And then be adaptive to see what happens, to see what's going on. Being adaptive led us to having seawater tanks, which led us to doing retail in a way that we'd never dreamed we would be able to do it. So then things start happening and you can start adapting to what the world's going to throw at you. But the idea in the beginning, I think, is just really focusing on quality. I think in my career, over the years, there comes time and you're just like, cash flow, I need to get oysters out. And maybe these aren't the best. And it's just like that battle you constantly have with, man, many times we starved because we felt we couldn't sell as many oysters as we wanted to because they weren't in good shape.
Yeah.
And it always came back to pay dividends because people remembered that it's quality. So when I picked up the phone again, they were like, yeah, of course, I'll take 10 bags, bang. Because they trusted me at that point in time that it was going to be quality product.
Right. Just building a reputation.
Yeah.
Very consistent.
And don't badmouth anybody else.
Aha.
Don't badmouth anybody else. It doesn't pay dividends.
No, that's fair. There, we mentioned having great friends and relationships in the industry. Are there producers who you admire and who you look to for inspiration nowadays? And I guess it doesn't have to be oyster specific either.
Yeah, wow. There's a lot there. We just did a whole Outstanding in the Field event with Stuart Brioza and Nicole Krasinski from State Bird Provisions and Anchovy Bar. And those guys are really inspirational about they're paying attention to quality ingredients and focusing on seafood, and they're the people who supply them like us and really championing people like us. So they inspire me quite a bit. I think over the years I've gotten to be great friends with the people at Hama Hama. They've come down. We've talked a lot about business and the changes in business. Adam and Liz are good friends of mine. Bill Taylor and I go back 40 years and can tell war stories and talk about all the changes we've seen. Love seeing, what Skip and Chris and the guys Island Creek have done over the years. We joke around that they were copying us when they started doing some of this. And it's just this great ribbing back and forth. They've gone way beyond. This cannery thing is just phenomenal that they're doing.
Yeah. Are you going to build a cannery to give
Yeah.
back to them?
Interesting. And to me also, we're trying to see where else we can help people in the business. So we have a young couple that have a business called Sunken Seaweed that we're subleasing to up in Humboldt Bay, because we believe in the whole seaweed space, but do we need to take on a whole new project? So how do we help people who are already doing that? So I'm really intrigued to see what happens in the seaweed space. Is this really as big of a deal as some of us think? Is it maybe not as big as it can be? How do we compete with dried seaweed snacks that are far produced somewhere else? Yeah, I'm trying to think where else I would look to for inspiration, but yeah, that's a lot of it. So
pretty good list. If you're taking a perspective of American oyster culture or North America in general, how do you feel like that is different than Europe, Australia?
So it's interesting being particularly in France, where I've spent the most time. France is all about tradition. Even though the oyster they're growing and the way they're growing, it hasn't been around for that long. You go to a certain bay and there's 500 growers and they're all doing it exactly the same way because that's how you do it here. What's so different in the States is everybody's doing it differently, even within the bay, which is a little maddening sometimes because it's just like there might be some advantages if we were a little bit more in step with each other sometimes. I think that's getting there in some of the gear types we're using and whatnot could make permitting a little bit easier. But that's what I see the big difference is the level of innovation in the States is much, much higher. I think Australia, I've seen a great deal of innovation in Australia. And I think a lot of that is they've got a lot of government support there to promote that industry and to build it into something. So it's interesting to see how that works over there. But those would be the differences I'd see. And again, maybe we helped start this trend, and whether it's a good trend or not, about this whole market name thing here, where everybody seems to be obsessed with having their own names for their oysters, which you don't see. In France, it's actually a newer thing. You're starting to see just a couple of companies like Girardeau or Tabariche start to market under their own names. And that was unheard of 10 years ago. Right. So it was all about this region. So very interesting.
Where would you want to go next for your next oyster adventure?
Where would I want to go next? I'm intrigued with Alaska. I know some of the growers up there, and there's been a push to do more of it up there. With global warming, that might be a good move. But for us, I think part of the reason to do the hatchery is to deal with changing ocean conditions. Unfortunately, the oceans are changing in a way that's not friendly to shellfish. We're a founding member of the Shellfish Growers Climate Coalition, and I think that's something we need to talk about more. We try to use resources very carefully. We offset 85% of our power in Marshall with solar panels. We're really trying to increase our fleet efficiency. We have the opportunity to sell everything we grow locally. We do some shipping, but we're never going to make that a big part of our business because we want to be careful of our carbon footprint. And then I think seeing Humboldt through to fruition, hopefully breeding oysters that can handle these changing conditions, and then intrigued with other potential species. Purple hinge rock scallops is a species out here that's a native species that a few of us, Joff Davis, have been working on hatchery techniques, looking at grow out techniques, looking at if I really want to be grand visioning in terms of California, that I think there's a lot of potential in Southern California, Santa Barbara Channel, and it could be seaweed, could be mussels, but rock scallops, the scallops are a much higher value crop. Could be a way of really seeing something work financially. I'd like to help see more young people get involved in this business. Unfortunately, it's gotten very cost prohibitive to permit new farms on the West Coast. And one of the things we're trying to do now is pay it forward. I started this company with $500. You can't do that this day and age. And that's a sad story because you don't have to build this empire. You don't have to do what we've done, but you could build a nice lifestyle growing shellfish if you could get over the hump of the permitting. And so I'd like to see more of that happening and see there more small farms out there.
Do a lot of your growers first work at Hog and then go off and try and start their own farms?
We've had a couple people, and not everybody is successful, but West Passage in Rhode Island, Graham is an ex-employee of ours. As Connor, my nephew, came and worked for us for a little bit, now has NC Oyster Company. And hopefully we've inspired a few more people around.
Eleanor asked, if you go for a tour, are you able to taste all 5 species of oysters you spoke about?
Not usually. We're working on that. It depends on the time of year. You can check in. As we head towards the end of the year, we're harvesting the European flats and the Olympias. We'll have them on hand to taste them all. But we are working towards having that more regularly available.
Okay. Once we organize an OMG field trip.
Yes, there you go. Yeah, if we were going to do that for special fields, for special people, we would do that.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Rachel asks, have you integrated much automation into your farming or processing methods? Well, you mentioned how much people love working for you, but automation can sometimes replace people. Would love to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, great questions. It's interesting. I know there's a lot of work underway on both on the growing end and on the processing end. We don't do a lot of that. Some of my experiences, especially on the growing end, is the more technologically advanced you get out on the water, the more susceptible you are to something breaking and having a problem with it. We do try to get a little bit more efficient. A lot of what I've seen in France, where you might be handling an individual bag out on the water, but as soon as it gets onto a boat, it's in some sort of vessel that could be picked up with a crane or a gantry or those kinds of things. So you're saving back injuries, making it more efficient that way. So it's not a high degree of mechanization, but it's just those touch points. And then the other one is on the sorting end. And that is a bottleneck for us. And it is something we're looking into. We do basically rotary or tumble sorters where we do just a rough sort on the product to begin with and then finish it with a hand sort. But we are looking at auto baggers. We are looking at a vision grader or weight grader. We do think there's an incredible amount of labor savings there. And it's a job where it's not incredibly enjoyable to be sorting oysters by hand 8 hours a day all the time. So we think we would make the job a little bit more enjoyable for the right people and be able to pay people a little bit more. And maybe, have a few less headcount out there on the sorting pad, but that's where we're targeting that mechanization piece is in the processing part of it.
I did have a question, and I asked you this 10 years ago. Do you ever see a product designation of origin or like a regional protection we talked a lot about like trademarks and branding and names, but do you ever see a PDO come into fruition in the States or North America or anything?
I think it might be a good idea. I don't know if I see it coming to fruition. Again, that sort of American proclivity towards independent thought. I know if we could get that over the hump. We've even talked about that. Bill Dewey and I over the years have talked about even codifying grading like they have in France to get everybody doing the same size. One of my frustrations with, we buy oysters from a lot of the growers. People probably know that I buy as many oysters as I grow to keep a variety on the menu. And we sell as a company, I think last year we sold 6.5 million oysters. And the amount of times I need to go back to people to work on their sizing, because no, an extra small is not this big, an extra small is this, or it's a weight, or I would see that almost be more important than the PDO, that piece of it. But I could see that being important, to tell you the truth, more on the East Coast. Just seeing the number of small growers and the number of different bays that people are growing in, it could be helpful in terms of identifying, product in the marketplace.
Yeah, we actually talk about that a little bit during our level 1 class, where just the fact that there is no standardization or there's no standard in grading and sizes and what's in the market. It's just, you just have to know that East Coast oysters are in 100 pounds and 50s versus like in dozens.
Yeah.
Doesn't. I love doing math whenever I have to try and figure out how many oysters to buy for an event. When you tell your customers about Hog Island, how much context around oysters do you give them to say, these taste like this because they're here versus something else?
Yeah, it's interesting. And I know you guys probably cover a lot of this when we do in our own staff education. We talk a lot about the differences in oyster flavor and how you transmit that information to a customer, because you're going to get questions. I had this oyster somewhere else. What do you think I'll like? We talk about the wine analogy all the time, right?
Right.
First and foremost is the variety. And that's why it will be fun to do an OMG event sometime where we come to Hog Island and we taste all 5 varieties, because that would really be highlighting that. And then secondly, of course, is instead of terroirs like merroir. And I used to say that a very small part of it is the hand of the grower, unless you're really screwing up. Tumble culture has changed my mind on that, because tumble culture can radically change the flavor dynamics compared to a beach-grown oyster in the same place. Mm-hmm. So anyhow, so what we try to tell people in the context we give customers is, and this is where it does come in to be important, Greg, that restaurants are listing an oyster from where it actually is, because that plays a big part in the flavor, right? So you don't want to say, yeah, this is a Pacific oyster from Washington State. Is it from the outer coast? Is it from Willapa? Is it North Puget Sound? Is it Hood Canal? Is it South Sound? So those things do matter. We look at that if I'm deciding who to sell oysters to, and I can be extremely picky these days, but we always did this, is if someone's listing oysters, that generally, I'm not going to sell to them. If they don't have the commitment to at least go, this is how they're going to be listed. They're going to be listed by variety and by region that matters, whether it's South Sound, this sound, East Coast being, is it Cape Cod? Is it here? Whatever we deem to determine those areas that are important. So pushing people in that direction, I think, makes a lot of sense. I think it's doing that work at the restaurant level. I think first and foremost, to make sure the restaurants are committing to doing that can make it easier for us, easier for customers to go, yeah, you had that oyster from that, you had that variety from that region. Let me point you to this one. It's going to taste very similar.
Right.
That's the education we try to do.
What about shucking?
What about shucking?
Shucking training, like being able to present your oyster.
Oh my gosh, yeah, we do. I can attest to this a little bit, and we put a lot of time and effort into telling people it's about technique way first before speed. I'm no longer as fast as I used to be. I don't enter shucking contests anymore. Years ago, the West Coast oysters, I got my ass smoked years ago on that, but we've had a few people who've come in second or third, Sean and Jose and those guys, but it's the other way we make some decisions around, am I going to sell oysters to a place, or is this a good, I think everybody on this call is probably in the same boat. There's nothing worse than going into a restaurant that prides itself on having an oyster program and seeing a scrambled oyster. Just, you got to be kidding me. So seeing a really well-shucked, clean oyster is I don't know, it's just a wonderful thing. When we try to teach people that, we wind up having to do refresher courses for restaurants, because there does happen to be some turnover in restaurants, and it's way easier to work with a restaurant who's committed themselves to doing that. And we don't have to come in again and again to do that.
It's part of the reason why OMG even exists, right?
Yes.
We wanted the education and recognition to follow the shucker or the oyster som wherever they go. Because I've seen friends who go into restaurants and they teach, and then all the people just leave after a year.
Yeah, exactly. You have to repeat it. You have to keep on thinking about it and stuff. And then there's flippers, right?
It's a healthy debate across all growers, whether to flip or not to flip. I feel like when it comes to Pacific oysters, deep cup, sure, there's a practical reason why you would flip that oyster. But for Virginica, I'm like, there's usually not.
Yeah, we are no flippers.
Ooh,
that's no flippers. Absolutely not. One of my founding partners used to do that and used to drive me crazy. And the fact is, you go to France, even Pacific oysters in France, not only are they not flipped, but they're not loosened. I thought that was interesting. The way I look at it is, it should be as the top shell has been removed and nothing has been touched. That's the perfect shuck.
I agree with you. Can you talk about seed sourcing? Are you still buying seed to complement your own production? About how much of your production is from your own hatchery?
Yeah, very little. We buy a little bit to augment the beginning of the year, but not only are we producing over 90% of our own seed, we're selling to about 20 growers up and down the West Coast. So we are producing seed for quite a few other growers. It's a fun thing. We're selling them seed, and then a year and a half later, we're buying oysters back to them to serve on the restaurants. We produce way more up there in the hatchery and nursery. I think this past year, the hatchery kicked out 45 million seed. The nursery's probably sold 20 million of that, and you're selling another 20 million of that.
And then that is actually like all the Pacifics, Kumamotos.
Yeah, don't have Kumamotos ramped up. We've sold the Kumamotos to a few other growers. Some of the growers we work more tightly with. We are trying to grow our own Kumamoto inventory in Humboldt a little bit larger first before we sell a lot of Kumamoto seed to others. But yeah, we envision this to be something that's going to help the industry more than just us.
And also the hatchery would support Olympia and
yes, yeah. So we're going to start working at that next is can we do some Olympia work there? And both for our commercial production, and we're involved in a couple of restoration projects in the Bay Area as well, trying to restore native reefs in San Francisco Bay and a few places. That's a tough one, with Olympia oyster. One, they're so slow growing. They're not all the populations in certain areas spawn every year. Sometimes they don't spawn except every 3 or 4 years, which is if you have any kind of problems in between that, it's hard to get a critical mass. And then the hydrology of a lot of our West Coast bays have changed. It's not like it was when the Olympia was everywhere.
And you have a dedicated team focused on the hatchery versus the farming. What is the size of the hatchery, like team-wise, compared to grow out?
So now the hatchery, I think this past year was, 4 full-time people, 2 part-time people. And then with the last year, 2022 was the first robust production year there. And we ran it seasonally. This past year, we started up earlier. This year, we're going to try to run it year round. It's a little harder to do in the wintertime up there to grow algae and do those things. We're just trying to get a head start on that part of it. The nursery, like I said, has been running for a while. We're buying small seed for people, and we have 3 flupsies. Now, I'm assuming everybody knows what flupsies are up there. And our flupsies are big. They're each 100-foot long, and they each have 32 3x3 by 4 foot bins. And so we can produce quite a bit of half-inch and above seed out of there. So that's been the exciting part of seeing that work.
Have you seen any impacts of climate change and or ocean acidification at this time?
Yes, I'd say the 2 things, not so much as warming water overall, but weather patterns. We think this past winter was a big indicator of what we're going to be seeing, which is what they projected, which is getting really severe storms that really impacted our business this past winter, where there were days you couldn't even make it out to the farm because of mudslides and trees down. Our salinity dipped down into the single digits for a week at a time, a couple of times, which I've never seen in 40 years of business. Wow. That's worrisome. The other thing is the ocean acidification. We are part of a network of monitors that we have real-time monitors on ocean chemistry, both on our Tamales facility and our Humboldt facility. Because as I said, must be 10, 15 years ago, we started seeing some crashes in the hatcheries of the Pacific Northwest that eventually became attributed to drops in pH for ocean water. We see that in Humboldt. We have real-time monitoring in there. And on a hatchery basis, you can manage it because we have a buffering system. So if the pH drops, we can inject a buffering solution made of ground up oyster shell and stuff to raise the pH back up. Hopefully it doesn't get too much worse to be affecting larger oysters out in the environment. Right now, it's really critical for the larvae because the larvae need the most soluble form of calcium carbonate to first form their first shells. So yes, we are seeing impacts already. So unfortunately.
That was a question from Hisam, by the way. Thank you for that. David asked, are you worried about the release of radioactive water from the Fukushima nuclear plant?
I am not, from what I understand. The monitoring I've seen, we haven't seen it reach our coast in a big way. I just heard something recently about that again that I might want to look into, about pulses coming across. So far, so good. Will remain to be seen. So
you test your water regularly?
We're not doing that for radioactivity, but the state has been. There's been a number of monitoring stations just offshore, and we can key into some of that data. And we haven't seen something that's been concerning yet.
Okay, good to know. And does your hatchery produce any triploids? What are your thoughts about those?
The triploids, we don't produce ourselves, our own brood stock. We do buy some triploid larvae or small triploid seed. We are part of a grant with Humboldt State University, or now it's Cal Poly Humboldt State, to try to, because what we have seen is there has been a lot of work on the genetic selection side on triploids. We believe they're a little weaker to begin with. And it's really important that we're doing some of the same work that we're doing on regular oysters to select for stronger performing families. Triploids are an interesting one. Like I said earlier, one of the reasons we grow Kumamotos and specifically the Atlantic or Virginica is we think that's one of our best avenues for a good summer oyster. Triploids get a little bit harder to explain to people in terms of they aren't GMO. This is a sterile, a mule, as we call them, all those kinds of things. We do utilize them. We also utilize moving around between our areas to try to get our hands on good, between our 3 areas in Tamales Bay. They all cycle through spawniness a little differently. They're triploidy or tetraploidy is part of the agriculture community way beyond oysters. A lot of the fruits and vegetables we eat are from that. I think we need to do a better job explaining to people what it means. And again, like I said, to do some work around the genetic selection around triploids to make them a little bit hardier. Because like I said, that's the one downside as a grower we see is you're going to have a problem. You're going to have a bigger problem with triploids. It doesn't make a lot of sense because they're not putting energy into reproduction, but they seem to be a bit weaker overall for us.
Maybe just like people. I don't know.
Yeah.
I don't know. Put in different conditions.
Yeah.
Funny. Thank you so much for taking the time, answering some very technical questions and just telling us your story. It's just really inspiring. And Hog Island has been really personally a huge influence in my oyster adventure. So it's really lovely to be able to do this with you.
Yeah. And it is an adventure. It continues to be an adventure. I mean, I love this business. I love talking about it. So it's all good. I'd love to hear, actually, put it on you, maybe not right now, but because I think a lot of the people on this call might be customer facing. What do they think about triploids? What's the feedback, or trying to explain it, or is it difficult? Is it something they don't think is a good idea?
You mean their customers or the people who are customer facing?
Both.
Okay. We can do that.
Yeah. It'd be nice to get some feedback on, hey, is this an easy thing to explain to people? Is it not? How does it make you feel? And is it uneasy, or all those things?
Yeah, I think everybody has their own take, but it depends on who you're talking to. But there's definitely verbiage that is more consumer friendly than others. So thank you so much again. And then let's plan that oyster tasting. Yes. We do it.
Yes.
Okay. So one of the things that we will try and do a Hog Island oyster tasting where you can ship out boxes of different oysters, and we'll get together again and have a good time.
Yeah, I like the idea too about your field trip. You should do that as well.